center margin, human nature, man woman, reason emotion, mind body, wealthy poor, white person of color, civilized savage, master slave, dependent independent dependent, teacher student adult child. So looking at this list together with potential students and us here today, I would group together a few of these dualisms and stack them together with superior, inferior, center, margin, and together with others to visually illustrate how Western industrial cultural dualisms work to set up what is often referred to as the norm of the standard. So I'm circling the left column to show you that these all entangled together contribute to sort of this notion of a norm or normalcy, or in the case of where we're going with this presentation and in this work, is with a neoliberal normalcy, right? And then anything to the right or outside of the red kind of circled area is marginalized, is labeled or understood or related to as abnormal, which is, I'm not condoning that label, but sort of pushed to the margins here and devalued. So I introduced these dualisms to illustrate how such assumptions organizing how we view one another, and especially our students, discipline our relationships. And I emphasize that while these dualisms inform how we think and act, they aren't definitive and they can be resisted. Specific to unsettling notions of normalcy, I want to take a look at a smaller grouping of them and how they work together. So now you're looking at just the superior, inferior, human nature, mind, body, teacher, student, adult, child, independent, and dependent. And I group a smaller group here together to just talk about this notion of independence as an illusion of neoliberal normalcy. The term and the subject positions in the first column, those that are most highly valued within Western industrial culture or within a neoliberal normalcy, clearly illustrate how subject positions of, for example, humanness and teacher or adult are highly valued and privileged by a cultural logic structure that values so-called independence, a construct awarded to members identified within the left-hand column here of the first list and inextricable from privileges afforded to some members at the exclusion and subjugation of others, the folks with characteristics on the right. Well, it could be easy to dismiss this kind of work because it seems like it would take forever to do and it takes a lot of time. What I'm kind of talking through here is that it really doesn't take up a lot of my class time, and it's not something that happens as a one-off. It's something that we kind of, in the work I'm doing, we keep out with us when we're writing, when we're talking, when we're organizing, when we're working together, to be sure that we're aware of the ways dualistic thinking as a habit of mind is sort of seeping into our relationships and how we understand the world. So finding that these lists illustrate how configurations of privilege and power can work to be understood, it can examine the dualisms in combination as being, how are we enabling or working with our groups or activist networks to, for all purposes here, to sort of destroy these binaries, to understand that, no such either-ors exist, but yet our cultural structures and our ways of understanding and relating to another tend to maintain them, and that they're really not representative of our ecological existence. So furthermore now, I ask students to consider how personhood is defined, often in current political and economic systems, by one's ability to conform to normalcy or to conform to these aspects listed on the left by providing an economic purpose as both a commodity and a consumer while presenting as independent, which is at best temporary because as children we are dependents and so will we be as we age. The whole notion of independence here is to expose it as illusionary. We are all dependent. And so let's say, for example, in schools, when we measure success based on our independence, we're setting up a foundation that's maintaining this illusion or perpetuating this notion of normalcy that doesn't really exist ecologically for any of us. Yet we privilege some who we award it to, and we punish, literally punish those that don't, viewing dependency as a problem. And I'm suggesting that we actually acknowledge all of our dependencies, and in doing so, we recognize that dependency is actually something we ought to value. Applying such logics, I ask students to consider, if a condition of personhood is independence, then are children and any being who visibly require assistance from so-called independence considered less than? Although such hierarchies examined through critical pedagogies and in teacher education programs, the direct relationship of independence and dependency to other dualisms depicted in the left are often overlooked, especially those of human nature, which is where eco-ability projects really kind of come in here for me. So it's my pedagogical intent that these provocative configurations or arrangements encourage teachers and future teachers to critically question the fundamental assumptions in Western industrial culture about relationships. And I hope that the list and the described process of how we draw attention to value hierarchies, dualisms, and the connection between them facilitates an understanding as to how these value hierarchies are intersectional and work, while noted that they are not universally experienced, to expose what is often valued and rewarded as normal in Western industrial culture. Furthermore, I share this because while considering teaching in neoliberal spaces like many kindergarten through 12th grade classrooms, students will work in, my students work in, we often find that practicing being able to recognize how these systems work is paramount to applying such an understanding to the curriculum and pedagogy as they grow as teachers. Really, it's paramount to rethinking the very ways schools work. So, I'm going to end with an illustration that I use with students to highlight how the logics upholding normalcy are predicated on false notions of independence exhibited by individuals, mostly white, able-bodied, neurotypical presenting males, who position and are often positioned by society as separate from and superior to everything and everyone else. So looking at this illustration, a learning heuristic, if you might, that we use in my teaching, it is from this elusive and biological impossibility, right? We all exist not as it's shown here in the illustration, but as a complex web of interdependent relationships, not hierarchized and separated out like this logic diagram here. But this logic diagram is to help us see that this is how Western industrial culture relates and understands relationships. Perceptions of self that are that identifies independent or individual as a definition of personhood is problematic. And we can see how all other beings in this way of understanding ourselves in relationship to others are then viewed as less than, and in neoliberal iterations of capitalism as colonized resources or commodities. This kind of thinking can be more clearly understood through the manifestation and the rationalization of behaviors like clear-cutting forests for lumber, or when any other being, living or non-living, is valued only in relation to its human use in regard to serving the interest of the individual I, that little dude up in the circle up at the top of the diagram, which in Western industrial culture is a temporarily able-bodied white wealthy or presenting as wealthy male. Labor or profit, value, all of these things are hierarchized over lives, such as people's lives, animals' lives, children's lives, women's lives, all kinds of diverse and different lives. This is how we rationalize children and women working in sweatshops, factory farming, the manufacturing of electronics and sneakers, or children prisoners serving time in for-profit prisons that lock up minors for nonviolent offenses, or how we rationalize orcas spending decades sentenced to a life swimming in confined pools for human entertainment. Whatever it is, it gets rationalized or justified in a logic structure that I think is kind of depicted in this illustration. So as activist scholars committed to the eco-ability movement, I'll end with emphasizing that this is not intended to explain to those who suffer know all too well how neoliberalism works. Rather, this is a tool for communicating to those who will never and can't ever understand fully what it's like to experience a life of being seen as less than and worth to those around us. So it's intended to help many of my students who are becoming teachers. All too often, the most privileged are those in power and making what they believe to be inclusive or accessible or culturally relevant changes to systems like education. Well, I'm advocating that that's got to change, and it's my hopes that through bringing eco-ability work to critical teacher education, like through radical animal pedagogies or work from critical animal studies activist scholars, that it can be facilitated for professionals allied to the community like teachers, that they can unlearn these oppressive value hierarchized conceptual frameworks. And maybe those illustrations that I showed you could help them in that process, recognizing that all of our core ecological existences are dependent on each other and all the living species. And in accordance with an eco-ability approach, that reminds us to be learners, ask questions, and listen. So I am sharing a few of the questions I am working through as I address my own layers of privilege in this work. First question, how do we recognize the ways colonialism and privileges of academia and formal education seep into our work? And how do we not teach about, but with diverse perspectives? Second, how do we recognize differences between allyship, solidarity, and appropriation instrumentalization? And how do we seek friendship with those too often silenced and ignored in activist work? Third, given the diverse context of our local relationships, what are some of the desired outcomes of direct action from eco-ability projects, students, K-12 teachers, and in schools and educational programs, etc.? And fourth, how do we work toward partnerships and diverse forms of resistance that recognize disability as difference and not devaluing difference?
All right, so if Jonathan and Marty can come up.